Hi, and thank you for joining the Hemophilia Federation of America, HFA, for our presentation on how to talk to your legislator. My name is Sarah Schenkman, and I am the Advocacy and Outreach Manager for HFA. This presentation is designed for patients and caregivers to help you prepare for your Legislative or Advocacy Day. During today's presentation, we will be talking about how you can prepare, what to expect during a meeting itself, as well as what you'll discuss and what role you'll play. We'll also go over what follow-up you can expect to do, including following your legislators on social media, sending thank you notes, and continuing to build that relationship after your legislative meeting. One of the key things that I'd point out just at the start here, oftentimes legislative meetings can be nerve-wracking for folks who may not have done this before. And always remember that legislators are people too. You are the expert on the subject of talking about access to care for bleeding disorder, and your legislators and their staff will be excited to hear what you have to say. Okay. So I'm going to dive into talking about ways to prepare for the meeting. You will likely receive some training from your local member organization or from HFA or NHF prior to going into a meeting. But these next few slides will help you kind of know what things that you can do to help make your meeting more successful. So first thing to do is, of course, to prepare. So I'll go over some of the tools that you can use for that in the next slide. You also want to know, what is your role? So are you the constituent? So are you the person who lives in the district or the area that the legislator represents? Or are you a participant? So meaning, are you the support where you might be there as part of the group, but you aren't a direct constituent? So understanding what your role is in a meeting is really important to making sure that everyone is able to get their points and stories across effectively in a timely manner. Okay, so once you have that information, some of the things that you want to be prepared for going into a meeting are, number one, make it local. So making a connection at the start of a meeting is a really good icebreaker. So I usually like to start by asking where the legislator or their staff is from, specifically, maybe where they went to school. This is a really good way to help, again, break that ice, make that connection, and then go into a successful meeting. The next thing you're going to want to work on is developing an elevator speech. And for those who may not be familiar with this term, an elevator speech is everything you would say about your story if given a 1 to 2 minute elevator ride with a captive listener. Meetings are usually not this short, but it is good to have at least a few sentences down about, number one, how would you describe a bleeding disorder? So for example, do you want to use the domino analogy? What is it that you think is important to convey? And then number two, 1 or 2 stories about how a bleeding disorder affects your life. So whether it be, you are affected yourself, or maybe a child is affected. What is a couple points that you really want someone to understand about what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder? Next, you are going to want to pick up 1 or 2 advocacy issues that you can relate to. So a few examples here. Maybe the issue you're talking about is access. If that's the case, then talk about the importance of your HTC or the relationship with your hematologist. Maybe the issue is Medicaid or CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. In this case, if you have experience on one of these programs, or maybe you know someone with experience, talk about how important coverage is for those who need it, and maybe an example about a time that maybe you've had to rely on one of those programs. If you don't necessarily have a personal connection with a specific issue that your group is discussing that day, that's okay. Just talking about general access and sharing your family's experience, so what services or providers have helped you access the treatment that you or your family needs. And maybe What is the alternative if you don't have access to those things? Choosing one or two stories that really illuminate that point is a great way to make sure that you're getting your points across. Some other things to focus on. So again, going back to that personalization, making that connection, for example, I'm treated at this place. If that hospital or treatment center is within that legislator's district, they'll want to know about it, about some of the providers that you meet with, that kind of thing. So really good to personalize the issue. Talking about access to medication, access to providers. And then lastly, the personal cost of having a bleeding disorder. So maybe what it's like to have a spontaneous bleed because of a knee injury. Maybe if you're a teen or a young person who's at a legislative meeting, you could share some of the things that you need to be aware of in school, or maybe in an extracurricular activity. Those type of things really, I think, humanize an issue and help make it relatable to the person that you're speaking with, because those are things that, while they may not understand what it's like to have a bleeding disorder, they can probably relate to what it's like to be, at school and having to talk with a teacher or an administrator about a serious issue, and then what the treatment plan is if an issue arises. So all really good things to keep in mind and to help you prepare for a meeting. Okay, so now that we've got some of our points on how to prepare for a meeting, and again, these are probably things that you'll go over in a training with your member organization prior to the meeting itself. These are also things that you could go over as a family or as a group, maybe the morning of, or in your hotel room or at home the night before. Really making sure that you are prepared going into it will help you to be more comfortable when you go into the meeting itself. And another thing, this is not on the slide, but something I just thought of here that can be helpful. I usually like to Google my legislator before going into a meeting, or someone who I'm meeting with, just to understand a little bit more about them, their history, maybe some of the current issues that they are concerned about, where they're from. Those type of points help me to just really put a face to the person who I'm with, and then it helps kind of make me feel more comfortable when I am in that meeting and I know what to expect. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what to expect during the meeting itself. So I think one of the most important things here is to be flexible. When it comes to flexibility, you want to be mindful that, when your meeting may change because, say, there's a vote that comes up and the meeting has to be postponed or canceled, where you're meeting. So occasionally we meet in the hallway or sometimes in the closet. We never really know exactly where we're meeting. Usually it's limited space, so just be flexible in that. And then with whom. Oftentimes we try to schedule meetings with the legislator themselves, but it could be that we're meeting with a staff member, and that's okay. Staff member's job is to make sure to relay those messages to their boss. And so rest assured that if you're meeting with staff, it doesn't mean that that's less important. It just means that there could be some flexibility in scheduling there. And we want to be grateful and make sure to still relay those same talking points across. Don't take these things personally. Many legislators don't have control over their own schedule. So know that, whatever that meeting looks like, it is still important. Okay, so following up on the last slide, we're going to put some of those things that we talked about in preparation into practice. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is to introduce yourself. So give a name, brief background on what bleeding disorders are, how they affect you. This is a good place to include, where you're from, maybe something local about you, maybe you play on a local sports team or you participate in a local theater club, that kind of thing. And I'll also note here, often people will say, how much should I talk about hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease or another bleeding disorder? A great thing to do is to just say, when you're introducing yourself, are you familiar with bleeding disorders? Are you familiar with hemophilia? Sometimes the person will nod, but they may not actually know a lot about the issue. So be prepared to just give a couple sentences about what a bleeding disorder is. We also may have folks that we meet with who have someone in their family with hemophilia. So if they say that, then you don't always have to quite go into that, domino analogy or another way of explaining a bleeding disorder. So usually that happens organically, but just be prepared to share in a few sentences what a bleeding disorder is. Okay, so next we're going to go into discussing the issue. So this is where roles are going to be really important. So usually we'll have someone as the lead who may introduce the issue, why it is that you're there to talk about, this particular ask. That person who's leading may also, share a little bit about the local bleeding disorder as well as maybe a national organization representative. Next, you're going to have someone share their personal story. And this may be a few people. We usually recommend that the constituent lead off with that, since that's who the person, the legislator, will be most interested to hear from. And then lastly, you're going to want to have someone talk about the ask. So the ask is usually referred to as either a bill that you want them to support, or maybe you're there to talk about just general access, because there's not a specific bill, that affects the bleeding disorders community. But making sure to know who it is that's going to round out that meeting with your ask is important. With all of these roles, I would suggest talking about them before you go into a meeting, especially those where you have limited time. You want to know, you're going to want to know kind of how that's going to work. It's almost like thinking about bookends, who's going to be your introduction, who's going to be kind of your chapters in between, and then who's going to be that conclusion afterward. Knowing that before you go in will help you make the most of your time. Some other things to be aware of in discussing the issue. One is conversation. So oftentimes we do a lot of preparation before we go into a meeting, talking about the issues and who's going to say what and when are they going to say it. But a legislator may, throw out a question at the beginning that either you're not prepared for or that may be off topic. It's okay to kind of go with them on that question, but then once you've had a chance to answer it, get back into what it is that you're there to discuss. And I'll also just note on that point of if you get a question at the beginning that you're unsure of, that is okay. Let them know, hey, I don't know what the answer is to that question, but I will write it down and I will make sure to follow up with your office afterward. Not only does that show that, you are interested in building that relationship, but that you want to follow up and get them the right information, and that you're going to be a good resource for them after the fact. Another thing to just be aware of is that we are here to discuss policy and not politics. So meetings are not the time to bring up your personal feelings on a certain issue. We are here to discuss our stories, talk about access, maybe a bill if that's what we've been asked to discuss. But we want to keep in mind that this is really about policy and not about politics. And then once you've had a chance to discuss your issues, share your stories, deliver that ask, usually there's one person in the group who will have a packet of information or a few documents. We call those leave behind packets. And they will give those to the legislator or their staff to follow up on issues. And one thing I always like to kind of remind folks with those leave behind packets is if you don't have a chance to talk about all of the things that you wanted to in a meeting, or maybe you forget a point, that leave behind packet will help facilitate that conversation and give them those talking points, that information that you want them to be aware of to follow up on after the fact. So, and sometimes those leave behind packets aren't always delivered in a meeting itself. Sometimes the member org or HFA or somebody will email that information after the fact so that they have those records in their files to refer back to on an issue later. Okay, and then lastly, during a meeting, always ask for a photo. It is always amazing to me that legislators, while they might not have a lot of time, they may have to rush through something, they're usually willing to take a picture with you. So don't be afraid to ask. It just takes a few seconds to do. And this is a good way to follow up after the meeting, whether you tag them in a social media post, maybe you email them that photo. Legislators love having their constituents meet with them, and so having that photo evidence to show will go a long way. So please make sure to do that. Okay, so some other points to be mindful of during a meeting. One of the things that we find as a patient advocacy organization, whether it be with bleeding disorders or other groups, is that we have certain terminology we use to talk about issues that affect us. So whether that be treatment, so, I treat, prophylactically, or I go to this HTC, or other complex terms. The people you meet with may not be familiar with these, so you want to make sure that if you're going to use a term that's specific to your bleeding disorder, that you explain what that is. So for example, instead of saying I treat at an HTC, make sure to say, I go to a hemophilia treatment center, maybe the name of that HTC that you go to. Some of the words that we find really resonate are things like access, rare and chronic, talking about prevention, quality and affordable care. So these are some of the points that you want to be mindful of when you're developing your elevator speech and talking about the issues. Again, we have that point. Remember, this is about policy and not about politics. Always be keeping that in mind as you're going into your meeting. And I think that's especially helpful, when you're going in and speaking with, somebody who you may know might not be in favor of your issue, or you think may not be in favor of your issue. Don't focus on the politics of it. Focus on how these issues affect you and what are your stories. And usually those things really resonate with the person who you're meeting with. Okay, so again, during the meeting, a few other things that you want to be mindful of. I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. You always want to offer to be a resource to build a relationship. I remember I was in a meeting in DC with a senator's office, and we had a few stories about Medicaid. And probably 6 months later, we got a call from the office who said, I remember meeting with you guys, you talked about Medicaid. Would you be willing to share more information about how Medicaid affects people with bleeding disorders? So offering to be that resource, whether it be, the next day or months or years to come, is a really important thing for us to do to help continue these relationships. Always make sure to say thank you. I think it can't be said enough how much we want to say thank you and acknowledge the legislator or their staff member, their time for meeting with you. Even if the meeting didn't go in the way that you expected it to, making sure to acknowledge the person's time is really important. You always want to take a business card so you can follow up with the person afterward. I know this is really helpful, so you have that direct email or phone number for someone. That information can be hard to find on a website after the fact, so taking it when you're in a meeting is good. And also feel free to leave your contact information with the staffer. That way, maybe they can get in touch with you. Sometimes they have a guest logbook when you walk into the office. So it's okay to leave your contact information as well as taking theirs. And one thing I'll just mention as far as as you're getting ready to leave and heading out, make sure that you do not discuss the meeting in the hallway as you are departing. We never know when maybe that staffer, the legislator, is going to follow directly behind you. Maybe they're heading out for lunch or for a vote or something like that. And we would never want for the meeting, for their impression of the meeting to be from what that conversation is that you're having in the hallway. So just be mindful of that. It's almost like going to an interview when you are interviewing for a job. You don't want to immediately pick up the phone and tell someone about how it went after the fact. Same thing applies for our legislative days. Okay, so some things for after the meeting. Send a thank you note. Thank you notes can come in the form of an email. Maybe it's a handwritten thank you note, or maybe you post something to social media. For state legislative days, handwritten note or social media post, or actually really an email, all three are effective. If you're going to meet with your U.S. representative, usually we recommend email is the best form of getting in touch with them because snail mail can be pretty slow getting to Capitol Hill. But you do want to acknowledge, even if you didn't leave on a question or a follow-up note, something specific, just sending them a quick, thanks for your time, looking forward to continue the conversation. Don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything else that I can help you with in the future. Those are some really good points to touch on in a thank you note. Also, use social media for your advocacy efforts. The benefit of social media these days is there are so many different ways to do it, and a lot of legislators are relying on social media as their primary way to let their constituents know what they're concerned about, as well as to collect stories about issues that are affecting their constituency. So find your elected officials online. I would say Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are really the main places that we're seeing our legislators on. Remember that when you are writing to folks, you want to be concise. You want to be mindful of spelling, and so make sure that what you're saying to them is concise. It also goes along with the bleeding disorders message, and one great way to do that is by using a hashtag. So there's an example here, Protect Our Care. That was something that a really popular hashtag around repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. We were using that in support of the ACA. And so finding, some sort of message that unifies both in terms of language as well as your hashtag is a really good way to unite the community. Don't be afraid of new media. Maybe you haven't used Twitter before, but you're interested in getting into it. You don't necessarily have to be posting all the time, but it's a really good way to be following the issues. If you have a question for your legislator, log into social media, ask them, through Twitter, hey, what are your thoughts on this issue? We find that offices, always respond to these things, or at least kind of acknowledge your comment in some way. So really good way to not only follow up, send a thank you, but then follow along with the issues after the fact. Another way to follow along with the issues is through HFA's Take Action Center. You can see that there's a link here which will bring you to our advocacy pages. If you go to hemophiliafed.org/advocacy, you'll see it, one of our top things is our Take Action Center. This site is specifically designed to help you in your advocacy efforts, whether that be at the federal or the state level. And if you log into that page, at the front of the page, you'll see that it talks about what our advocacy efforts are, what we're looking to get community members involved with in that moment. Down on the page, you'll also see federal legislation that HFA is tracking. And then towards the bottom, there's a map of the country, and you can click on your state, and it'll bring up all the bills HFA is tracking in your state. So if you're interested in following along after your advocacy day, this is a great way to see where a bill advances, from committee to the floor. You can follow along after the fact. The Take Action Center also has a place for you to log in your address and pull up the federal, state, and local information for your elected officials to be able to continue that conversation. So definitely use this to your advantage. These resources are for you to make sure that you're able to practice advocacy, not just on the legislative day, but in the days to come. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. HFA welcomes any questions that you may have regarding advocacy. We have our email address, which is on this page here, advocacy@hemophiliafed.org. Let us know if you have any questions. If you would like additional resources, we have a new toolkit available on our website. That is all for patients and caregivers in preparation for Legislative Day. We also have within our advocacy pages all sorts of different documents, presentations, and other things that will help you be a stronger advocate for yourself and for your family. So thanks for your time. We appreciate your interest in getting more involved in advocacy or continuing your advocacy efforts. And we look forward to seeing you either at your state capitol or on Capitol Hill in DC soon. Thanks and have a great day.